Stray dog follows unknown man to his house. The man lets him in, and the dog reveals a secret that leaves him speechless and makes him cry without. Have you ever felt like an animal was watching you in a different way, as if it knew something you didn't? Sometimes dogs look at us with an intensity that seems to cross time, as if they see what we can perceive. It was exactly this feeling that came over Michael on that cold autumn afternoon, as he walked through the silence of Denver, feeling the cold wind touch his face. Yellow and orange leaves littered the sidewalks, swirling through them with each gust of wind. The sound of cars in the distance was drowned out by the constant breeze, and the city seemed enveloped in melancholic calm. Michael, as always, walked home without rushing, just counting the steps until the moment he could rest. But that afternoon, something was different. He felt it first as an instinct, a slighter presence. As he subtly turned his head back, he saw the dark silhouette of a dog walking a few meters away from him. The animal did not aggressive nor even lost. He just walked as if he were following him. His dull black fur contrasted with the dry leaves scattered the ground, and his eyes, even from a distance, had a fixed, attentive shine, as if every movement was important to him. Michael tried to ignore it. Maybe it was some random stray dog, waiting for a piece of food or just aimlessly, like so many I'd seen before. But there was something about him, something about the way he didn't deviate, didn't slow down, always the same distance, as if waiting for the right moment to approach. The wind blew stronger at that moment, making Michael shrug into his coat as if the sudden cold were a warning, an invisible whisper from the city hymn. He rubbed his hands together to warm himself and looked away at the traffic light, watching the red light against the wet asphalt from last night's rain. The streets were silent. Only the distant sound of a car passing by every now and then broke the tranquility of the afternoon. Even without meaning to, his thoughts returned to Dog. He felt that presence before he even looked back, as if the weight of that silent gaze was strong enough to pierce the of instinct. He turned slowly, and there he was. The dog remained sitting in the place a few meters away, its body firm, its head slightly tilted to the side, its ears pricked up. I watched. There no anxiety in his eyes, no agitation in his movements. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't approach me asking for affection. It was just there. Michael frowned. Street dogs in general react to any attention. They bark, advance cautiously in search of food, show some type of expectation. But that one looked, expect something more. The signal changed. Michael hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment, as if there was unresolved between him and the strange animal. But life called back to normality. He took a deep breath and continued forward, the street with long, quick steps. When he reached the other side, something inside him forced him to look again. He couldn't help it. The dog there, motionless in the same posture, its eyes fixed on him. And it was at that moment that Michael felt a strange feeling grow inside his. This wasn't just a lost dog. Before he could process what that meant, Animal stood up. There was no warning, no hesitation. He just got up on all fours and started crossing the street, as if he already knew exactly where needed to go. Michael felt a shiver on the back of his neck. The dog didn't run. He didn't show fear of passing. His steps were calm, determined. He wasn't just following Michael, he was returning to one place. Have you ever felt an animal was trying to communicate with you in a way only it understood? That intense look, an unexpected behavior, as if he knew that no one else noticed. If you've experienced something like this, share it in the comments. I'd love to read your story. Surely you exciting animal stories, so leave your like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to continue receiving incredible stories. Like some dogs not only look, but look right through us. It is something that can be explained in words only sense, a type of silent connection that does not need gestures or sounds, just the certainty somehow that animal understands something that humans have not yet understood. And that was exactly what made this dog different. Wasn't just another stray dog wandering aimlessly, waiting for the next meal or the next act of kindness. There was an invisible purpose behind each his movements. His thin body revealed that he had already been hungry, but his posture was not that of a dog. His dirty, shaggy black fur suggested he had been alone for a long time, but there was no fear in his eyes. Determination. His walk was calm without hesitation. He didn't get too close, but he didn't move away either. Michael's every step was mirrored with, if Michael stopped, the dog stopped. If Michael advanced, he followed. There was no rush, nor that desperation of an abandoned dog begging for attention. He just followed, observing as if he was waiting for the right moment to be noticed, tried to ignore it. He continued walking, his steps sinking slightly into the dry leaves scattered on the ground, the cold wind biting his skin, even his coat. But the feeling of being followed never left him. The dog's presence was there, constant, like a silent that refused to be left behind. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, without rushing, without hesitating, without any about the path he was taking. Most street dogs look at people with a mixture of pleading and uncertainty, ready to run if they see any, but that dog wouldn't look away. He didn't try to hide, he didn't back down, just waited. That look, firm and insistent, a silent question. Something that Michael couldn't decipher, but that was there, present in the glow of that animal's eyes. It wasn't a look of need, fear, nor insecurity. It was something deeper, something that made his chest tighten without him knowing why. For a moment, he tried to push the out of his mind. It was just any dog, an ownerless dog who, for some reason, had decided that he would be the person to follow Day. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he was used to chasing people in the hope of finding a home. Deep down, Michael knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong with this explanation. This dog didn't seem to be following him just because. Instinct told him this wasn't a random encounter. Michael picked up his pace, testing whether the dog would hesitate. He didn't hesitate. He the same distance, without showing any effort to keep up with him, as if he knew exactly how far he needed to go. The city continued, its normal people entered and left coffee shops. Couples walked hurriedly. Children laughed on benches in the squares. But for the world was starting to take a back seat. There was just him and the dog. The animal's silence seemed to carry an invisible weight. A story had not yet been told. He didn't look lost, he didn't look scared. His look said something that Michael still couldn't understand. But he already knew that that dog, "I wouldn't leave your side." Some dogs don't need to bark to be heard. They communicate everything through their eyes, the way they move, the way they occupy the space around them. And that dog did just that. Michael tried to ignore him, continue on his way as if this encounter meant nothing, but something in him wouldn't let that happen. The gaze was fixed, attentive, full of, and that was unusual. It wasn't just any stray dog wandering aimlessly, without destination, without purpose. He didn't beg for food. He seemed scared. He didn't show that anxiety of someone who never knows where they're going to sleep the next night. No, he knew exactly where he was. Somehow he seemed to know exactly where Michael was going too. When Michael reached the front gate and unlocked the lock, he waited for the dog to interest. Many stray dogs follow people for a few blocks, perhaps hoping to find shelter or food, but at some point there is nothing for them and give up. That one, however, didn't hesitate. He stopped exactly at the entrance of the house, going beyond the limit of the gate, without advancing a single centimeter beyond the line that separated the street from the yard. He didn't jump the fence. He didn't try to squeeze through some open space. He didn't fuss like a dog eager to get in. It just stood there still, its tail wagging slowly, as if it was waiting for something. Michael felt a growing uneasiness come over him. Not only was the dog there, he was, but what are you waiting for? His gaze carried something that Michael couldn't decipher, as if he was trying to convey a message that couldn't put into words. He whimpered softly, an almost contained sound, like a silent request. Not for affection, but for permission. It wasn't an ordinary request. It wasn't the desperate plea of an abandoned dog. It was something deeper, something Michael felt before he even understood. Time seemed to slow down the moment Michael kept his hand on the gate, yet making the final decision. There was something irrational about that hesitation, an intuition that didn't make sense, but that tightened his chest, a silent warning. The dog remained there, motionless, watching him without blinking, breathing slowly. His eyes filled something that Michael couldn't interpret. He tried to convince himself that there was nothing special about the situation, that it just a random dog waiting for a chance to get in. But why then did every cell in your body say that that moment had a different weight? Why I feel that if I took that step, something would change. The cold afternoon air blew against his skin, carrying the damp smell of fallen leaves in yard, and without quite realizing what he was doing, his hand pushed the gate inward. The dog's reaction immediate, without hesitation, without suspicion, without the typical caution of an animal entering unknown territory. There was no in his behavior, no pause to sniff the environment, no attempt to explore as a dog used to invading backyards in search of shelter. Would he pass through the gate with the ease of someone who already knew exactly where he was going, as if this wasn't the first time he'd crossed that entrance, as if he were just retracing a familiar path. Michael, each step, feeling a growing uneasiness as the dog continued forward without straying, without stopping, without even looking to the side. The cupboard, with an uneven carpet of dry leaves, creaked slightly under his paws, but he paid no attention to it. He didn't look at the furniture on balcony. He didn't examine the vases spread across the floor. He didn't show any surprise at being there. It was as none of this was new. He simply walked, determined, focused, guided by something Michael couldn't see. The silence around him suddenly felt as if the surroundings itself were holding their breath along with him. Michael felt his stomach sink, his mind to process what he was seeing, but not finding an explanation that made sense. That dog wasn't just walking into a new place. He was in that, for some reason, sent an icy shiver running up his spine. What did that animal know? Why did his movements feel so right, so natural? If he had walked through that yard hundreds of times, doubt echoed within him like a persistent whisper, bringing an uncomfortable feeling that clung his chest like an invisible weight. Something was happening there, something he still didn't understand. That somehow had already started long before he realized it. And you, what do you think? Tell me below in the comments. Some encounters seem random, carry a strange feeling of familiarity, as if something is repeating itself without us understanding it. Michael never considered himself an intuitive, but everything about that dog awakened a silent discomfort, an invisible warning that he couldn't. There was something about the way the animal moved, the way it walked around the yard without hesitation, curiosity, without the uncertainty typical of a dog entering a new place for the first time. He didn't sniff the corners. He didn't explore. He didn't show any surprise. He just followed, as if he was exactly where he was supposed to be, as if you already knew that before you even crossed the gate. Michael ran his hand over his face, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that growing inside him. Since Emily's death, he had learned to live with the silence of an empty house. He had never felt anything like it, a presence so strong, so strangely certain, that it seemed to fill every space around him without asking. He looked again at the dog, who was now standing a few meters away from him, sitting on hind legs, his head slightly tilted to the side, his eyes attentive to his every movement. The tail was wagging slowly, without excitement, anxiety, just a steady rhythm, as if it was waiting for something. Michael took his cell phone out of his pocket and typed quickly, without thinking about what he was writing. Man, a dog followed me home. Looks like he already knows this place. Weird, right? He waited for a few, feeling the cold screen of his cell phone against his fingers, hearing only the sound of the wind blowing through in the backyard. The dog continued to stand still without looking away, and that made him in a way he didn't want to admit. The cell phone vibrated. That's bizarre. Are you sure you've never seen this dog before? Michael, the message, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say yes, that it obvious that I had never seen that dog before, but I couldn't say it with the certainty I wanted to. Something inside him hesitated. He typed few words but deleted it before sending. He felt ridiculous for being so affected by something that should be simple. It was just a dog. It. He looked at the animal again, as if he expected it to give him an answer, but all he got back was that fixed, intense look, filled with something couldn't name. He took a deep breath and typed again. It sounds crazy, but he doesn't act like a lost puppy. He's looking at me, he knows me. It's weird, David. This time the answer came almost immediately. And what is he like? Michael looked up to look at more closely. Big, thin, black, it looks like a Labrador, but it's dirty, worn out, like it's wandering around for a long time. The dog blinked slowly, as if he felt he was being described, as if he knew he was the one they were about. The tail flicked once, then stopped. The cell phone vibrated again. Wait, a black Labrador? Like black? Michael frowned. Yes, why? There was too long a pause. David was typing but not sending anything. For a moment, Michael thought they had failed, but then his cell phone vibrated once again. I just thought it was curious. Are you sure you've never had a dog like before? Michael's heart gave a strange jump, a tightening that came out of nowhere and made him hold his, "What question is that? You know better." Another pause. David's response came short, almost too casual to be genuine. "Forget it, I just thought it was weird. Are you going to let him stay?" Michael looked away from his cell phone and at the dog once again. The animal hadn't moved, hadn't tried to get, hadn't shown any kind of impatience. He just waited, as if he knew that the decision wasn't up to him. Michael didn't have a clear to David's question. He didn't know what he would do, he didn't know what that dog meant. But somehow, he already felt the decision was no longer in his hands. The dog was already there, and for some reason Michael knew he wouldn't leave. sometimes seem to sense things that we don't notice, small details that we ignore, subtle changes in the environment, invisible presences that escape understanding, but not theirs. Maybe it's instinct, maybe something more than that. But anyone who has ever lived with dog knows how much they react to things that seem non-existent. Michael didn't think much about these things, or he had never given them much attention until that moment, until he saw that dog who had never been there before, walking around his house as he knew every corner, every shadow, every detail. He had decided to let him in, but he hoped that after a while the dog lose interest, perhaps lie down somewhere to rest, or simply realize that there was nothing there for him but that wasn't what happened. The dog didn't appear to come in just to take shelter. He didn't act like an animal that had found a new home, nor did he show the anxiety of dogs after a long time on the streets finally find a home. His behavior was neither one of relief nor gratitude, good even out of curiosity. He didn't sniff every corner. He didn't explore the furniture. He didn't walk like someone who needed to know that his look was not that of someone who was discovering a new place. It was from someone from who remembered. Michael tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling it caused. It was just a lost dog that found open door and decided to go inside. Nothing beyond that. But then the animal began to walk slowly around the house, breathing low, its ears slightly raised, attentive to everything. He walked with an unsettling calm, without straying, without being distracted, as if were following something invisible. He passed through the living room without showing any interest in the furniture, crossed the hallway without ignored the kitchen, walked past the entrance rug, and went straight to a specific part of the house. Without knowing why, felt his breathing become heavy, his muscles becoming tense before he even understood why. The dog stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Not just any, but that ladder, the place Michael avoided looking at for too long. He stood there silently, his head slightly raised, his ears now straight, his tail paralyzed. He didn't move, didn't turn to look at Michael, didn't whimper. He just stood there waiting, as if he knew moment would happen. Michael felt a shiver run up the back of his neck. His eyes slowly went to the direction the dog was facing, and as he saw where he was looking, he felt his stomach sink. The cellar door. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was just a... But then the dog suddenly got up and started barking. First it was a short, almost hesitant bark, as if a reaction. Then came another, stronger one, and then one more. Within seconds, the heavy silence of the house was broken by a loud, insistent, a desperate, ferocious bark, a sound that seemed to come from a place much deeper than the throat of any dog. Michael flinched, feeling his chest tighten, as the animal took a step forward and barked again. He wasn't just bothered, he was trying to warn. That had been closed for years, locked, ignored. It was a corner of the house that Michael avoided looking at, that he made a point of pretending exist. He had no reason to go down there, and he preferred it that way, but that dog wasn't just curious. He wasn't to explore a new environment. He was barking at that door like he knew exactly what was on the other side, as if I had been there before. As he expected, Michael remembered something he himself didn't know he had forgotten. His heart beat faster. The puppy scratched the wood with its paws, even louder, as if trying to extract a secret that had been hidden for too long. Michael couldn't move. The body was rigid. The mind was spinning. Were confused between logic and instinct, between fear and the need to understand. Something was happening there, something he could no longer ignore. Dog turned to him for a brief moment, eyes shining in the dim light of the house, carrying something Michael couldn't define. Then he started barking louder, more intense, as if it wasn't just a warning but a requirement. Michael felt an icy shiver run down his spine. He believed that dogs could carry messages from the past, but at that moment, for the first time, he felt that maybe he was wrong. Why do some dogs to know exactly what to do, as if they were guided by something that we humans could never see? Maybe it's instinct. Maybe it's something that goes beyond what we can explain. But anyone who has ever lived with a dog knows how to recognize when an animal a purpose, when he is trying to show something, when he doesn't accept ignored. Michael knew this even if he tried to convince himself otherwise. He saw in that dog's eyes that there was something restlessness, beyond curiosity, beyond the simple desire to enter a new environment. He didn't just to explore the house, he didn't want food, he didn't want a place to rest. He wanted to arrive, but in front of that door, I wanted to open it. The bark continued to echo through the corridor, strong, insistent, reverberating off the wooden walls, as if it were more than a sound, as if it carried something much bigger inside it. The dog took one step forward, Another scratching the door with its paws, as if it was begging for it to be opened. Michael felt the weight of that moment growing inside him, his quickening involuntarily, his mind fighting between logic and that more instinctive part that said this wasn't normal, that this wasn't just a dog acting randomly. He looked at the door, his fingers tingling, his heart beating faster than it should. That lock hadn't touched in years. The basement was part of the house, but it was not part of his routine. He never needed to go in there. Never to go in there. But now, with no choice, he was standing in front of her, staring at the ancient wood, smelling the subtle smell of dust and wood, listening to the dog bark as if his life depended on it. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, exhaled and ran his hand through his pocket, feeling for the small set of keys he always carried. He found the right one by its shape. Its familiar, the cold metal against his skin. He hesitated. The dog stopped barking for a brief moment, as if sensing he was about to do what needed be done. Michael swallowed hard, his hand shaking slightly as he took the key to the lock. The sound of scraping against the ancient mechanism was too loud, and for a second he almost flinched. But he turned the key. The click echoed through corridor like a heavy final sound, with no return. As soon as the door opened, the dog bolted down the stairs. He didn't look back, he didn't wait for any command. He simply ran, his paws touching the wooden steps quickly, his thin body disappearing the dim light of the basement, without a second of doubt. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine, but he couldn't move, he didn't want to go down. He felt like something inside that basement had been waiting for him for too long, something that wanted to be found, but that now could no longer be avoided. He took a deep breath, rested his hand on the doorframe and forced his feet move. Each step creaked under his weight, the smell of damp and dust increasing with each step. Dim light from the lone lamp hanging from the ceiling cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor, creating shapes that seemed to move as he went. Dog was crouched in a corner of the basement, its paws frantically digging against the boards, its eyes fixed on a specific spot, as if it knew exactly it was doing. He wasn't randomly sniffing the floor, he wasn't exploring the environment. He following any scent. He knew something was there. Michael felt his chest tighten. The sound of the dog's nails scraping against them made a dry, harsh noise, a sound that mixed with the animal's hurried breathing and the muffled echo his own footsteps as he approached. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dust, but as the dog dug, small chips fell away, revealing a slightly darker surface beneath. Then a metallic reflection, a rectangular shape hidden beneath the old boards. Michael knelt beside the dog, his heart racing, his fingers the cold surface of the object that was now partially exposed. The wood was loose, and with a stronger pull, he managed to pull away what left of the cover, completely revealing what was buried there. It was a box, iron old, with a small, rusty padlock its lid. He ran his hand over the rough surface of the metal, feeling the weight of that discovery before he even understood what it... The dog stopped digging. He just sat next to the box, watching Michael with intense eyes that seemed to carry knowledge he would never understand. The man's chest rose and fell in short breaths, his mind to accept what was happening, but his body reacting as if it already knew that something was wrong. That dog hadn't followed Michael by he wasn't there because he wanted a home or because he got lost and found refuge. He was there because he wanted Box to be found. He was there because I was waiting for this moment. Michael swallowed hard, ran his hand over and felt the cold metal beneath his fingers. The padlock was old, corroded by time, but still resistant. He didn't know he didn't know how long it had been there. He didn't even know if he was ready to know. But somehow, I already knew there was going back. That dog brought him there for a reason, and now he would need to find out which one it was. Some memories don't completely. They just slumber in some corner of the mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Small details can bring them. A smell, a song, an object. But there are things buried so deeply that they become almost unreal, as if they belonged another life, to another person. Michael felt it now, looking at that iron box covered in dust, feeling the cold of the metal, his trembling fingers. His mind tried to make sense of it, organize the pieces of the puzzle, but there was one detail couldn't ignore. How did that dog know that box was there? How did he, an animal that had never been in that house before, exactly where to dig, as if he had always known this cellar, as if he had always been waiting for this moment? The dog was sitting next to him, silently, his breathing still quickened from the effort of digging, his eyes attentive to Michael's every movement. There was something in the expression, a kind of patience that seemed to say that this moment was inevitable. He didn't show curiosity. He didn't try sniff the box. He didn't move like any dog would when faced with something unfamiliar. He just waited. Michael ran his hand over the box, feeling the roughness of time corroded over the iron. The padlock was old, rusty, but still firm. He tried pull it with his hands, but it wouldn't budge. The dog moved his ears and leaned forward slightly as Michael stood up, walked over to a shelf and picked up an antique hammer that had been sitting there for years. The cold metal felt heavy in his hand, and for a moment hesitated, looking at the box as if it were about to open on its own. Then he took a deep breath, held on tight and struck the once, twice, 3 times until the latch broke with a sharp click. The sound echoed through the basement, reverberating the heavy silence of the room. Michael set the hammer aside, looked at the dog, who blinked slowly, and then reached for the lid, lifting it. An old smell filled the air, a mix of aged paper, accumulated dust, and damp. Inside, bundles of yellowing letters were neatly stacked, held together by faded ribbons, others loose, folded carefully, as if they had been left there by someone intending to return for them. Beside them, a silver necklace rested on the papers, a pendant shaped like a dog's paw reflecting the little light coming from the ceiling. Michael felt it in his chest without knowing why. His gaze swept over the contents of the box, his breathing slowing, as if something inside him knew he would find something there that he wasn't ready to see. He took one of the envelopes, ran his fingers over the surface of the paper, feeling the time imprinted on the yellowish texture. The dog moved its front paws impatiently, but didn't come any closer. He hoped Michael would see for himself. Pushing some cards aside, something else appeared at the bottom of the box that made his heart make a painful leap inside his chest. A photo. He hesitated for a moment before picking it up, and as soon as his eyes fell on the A-wave of repressed memories, exploded within his mind. It was him and David, children, smiling, sitting on of their parents' old house. Between the two, a small black Labrador puppy with bright, lively eyes. The dog was wearing a necklace, a silver paw-shaped pendant, identical to the one in the box. Michael's breath hitched. His body went rigid, his heart heavily, as if each beat echoed the memory of a time he had forgotten. But now, holding that photo, seeing that puppy looking back at him the years, it all started to come back. The dog next to him moved, slowly got up, came a little closer, and his paw on Michael's leg. When he looked at the animal, he saw something that completely took his breath away. Those eyes. Same brightness, the same intensity. The black Labrador in the photo and the dog that was next to him now had the same look. Some memories never disappear. They can hide in dark corners of the mind, buried under the passing years, dormant among more recent memories. But all it takes is a single trigger for them to awaken with full force. And when that happens, it's as if time ceased to exist, as if that forgotten was ripped from the past and thrown violently into the present, as if nothing had changed. Michael felt exactly that as he held photo, his fingers pressing against the yellowed paper, his hands shaking, his heart racing inside his chest. The before his eyes was a time capsule, concrete proof of something he didn't know still existed inside him. He and David, so young, carefree, the smiles that only childhood allows, and right between the two, a black Labrador puppy, small with shiny hair, eyes attentive, expressive, full of the world around, seemed to lose its sound, as if everything had become distant, muffled, as if only that memory mattered now. Michael felt his heavy, his mind spinning, trying to understand what was happening, because he remembered now. He remembered the puppy's smell when he him on his lap, the light weight of his small, warm body. The afternoons when he and David ran around the shadow, always at their side, his small paws trying to keep up with the children's speed. He remembered way Shadow followed them everywhere, as if they were the center of his world, as if nothing else mattered other than the 3 of them. She remembered the cold nights when he curled up at her feet, the sound of his calm, the way he tilted his head when he heard his name. But most of all, I remembered the day he disappeared. Shadow disappeared on autumn afternoon, exactly like that one, when dry leaves covered the ground and the wind blew coldly through the streets. He looked for him for days, shouted his name through the neighborhood's alleys, asked neighbors, put up posters, searched every corner of the butt. It was as if he had simply evaporated. The puppy that slept next to them every night never came back. And over time, pain of loss turned into a hazy memory, into an empty space that was never filled, until it finally became part of the past. But now that photo was in his hands, ripping the past from its hiding place and forcing him to face an impossible truth. The truth he didn't want to. The truth that was sitting right in front of him. Because that dog, The same one that had followed Michael through that entered that house without hesitation, that found that box buried in the basement, had the eyes, those eyes, the same stare, the same intensity, the same expression that seemed to go through time and reach him in a way that no other had ever done. Michael's stomach turned, an icy chill running every inch of his body, as his mind desperately tried to find a rational explanation. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be the dog. Shadow disappeared ago 30 years. This animal in front of him was an adult dog, strong. Although thin from time on, the time couldn't have stopped for him. That was impossible. The sound of the door opening broke the daze he was in. The footsteps echoed through the hallway, and within seconds, David appeared at the entrance to the basement, his eyes wide as he saw his brother on the floor, holding that photo with ragged breaths. The confusion on his face was clear, but as soon as his eyes on the dog next to Michael, all color seemed to drain from his expression. The world seemed to stop when David took a step, as if he needed to hold on to something invisible to keep from losing his balance. Michael didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to point to the photo or explain what he was feeling, because David felt the same thing. He saw. Hyatt. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His breathing was short, his eyes fixed on that animal in an almost incredulous way. The silence became heavy, as if they were both trying to make sense of something that defied all logic. David swallowed hard, opened his mouth to say something, but his voice off. He tried again, forcing the words out, but they came low, almost like a whisper, filled with a fear he didn't want to admit. Is this Shadow? The question hung in the air, suspended between them, between doubt and the impossible, between the present and a past that they never completely forget. The dog remained there, motionless, watching the two, as if he knew that moment come. His eyes, the same eyes from so long ago, were fixed on them, waiting for them to accept something that seemed. Michael felt his heart pound against his chest, his fingers clutching the edge of the photo as if it anchored him in reality. He wanted to respond. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to say that it makes sense, but nothing made sense because the dog in front of them era Shadow. Or at least, everything inside him screamed it was. Some things never really leave us. They can disappear from view, disappear over the years, be hidden under of time and new memories, but there is always something that keeps them alive within us, even if we don't realize it. Some absences never replaced, only silenced. Michael knew this because no matter how much he had moved on with his life, no matter how many years had between that day and the present, he had never forgotten Shadow. He never forgot the emptiness he was left with when his disappeared, the weight of that goodbye without explanation, without a last look, without a he and David were just children, but the pain of loss was too great to simply forget. They searched everywhere, called his name until they're broke, put up posters, asked neighbors, searched alleys and backyards, but found nothing. No clues, no traces. Shadow disappeared, as if he had been ripped from their lives without a trace. Michael always imagined that somewhere, perhaps someone had found thee and given him a new home, or that in a sadder scenario, he had been lost forever. It was easier to accept that than to any other possibility, than to spend years trying to find explanations that would never come. But now, standing holding an old photo from 3 decades ago, while a black Labrador watched him with eyes full of impossible recognition, something inside him to shatter. He wanted to say that it was just a coincidence, that this dog was just another Labrador, that his mind was trying to emotional gaps with absurd explanations, but how to explain the fact that he found it right there? How could I ignore that he knew exactly where to go? How can we forget that it was this same dog that guided Michael to the hidden box in the basement? Was still motionless, his gaze fixed on the dog as if he were seeing a ghost, his shoulders tense, his chest rising and falling at a rapid pace. Knew him well enough to know that he was thinking the same thing, trying to find logic where there was none, trying to fit the impossible into. But there was no way, because everything that dog did, everything he showed, everything about him screamed something Michael didn't want to accept. The silence between the three became unbearable. The dog, sitting in front of, cocked his head to the side, a gesture so familiar that it made something inside Michael snap. It was the same way Shadow had, when expected someone to understand what he wanted to say. It was the same look, the same silent patience, the same it was as if no time had passed for him, as if he had been waiting for that reunion since the day he disappeared. Michael felt his throat, his eyes burning with a heaviness he hadn't expected. He wasn't the type to cry easily, but there was something about that was messing with all his certainties, that was breaking the barrier between what was possible and what wasn't. looked at David, waiting for his brother to say something, anything. But he remained silent, lost in the same confusion. "It can't be him," Michael finally, but his own voice sounded weak, unconvincing, as if he were trying to convince himself of something he didn't in. David didn't respond right away. He swallowed hard, ran his hands over his face, looked back at the dog, who remained motionless, waiting. "But what if it is?" The words came out low, hesitant, as if was afraid to say it out loud. Michael shook his head, trying to shake the idea, but he couldn't. The dog slowly got up, walked towards him and his head against his knee, closing his eyes for a moment, as if he knew that that touch meant something much greater than any. Michael felt the weight of the moment, the heat of the dog's body against his leg, calm rhythm of his breathing. He knew that feeling. He remembered when Shadow did this when he was a puppy, how he would lean his head on him whenever wanted comfort, whenever he wanted to say something without needing words. David exhaled, a nervous laugh, his lips filled with disbelief. "This is crazy, man." Michael didn't disagree. But then he looked at the dog again and noticed that made him forget any attempt at rationality. The silver necklace with the dog paw pendant was in the box, untouched, just as he remembered. But on the dog's neck there was a subtle mark. A circle, the hair was slightly thinner, as if something had been worn there for too long. A collar that somehow was no longer there, but been there before. A collar that perhaps many years ago carried exactly the same pendant that now rested inside that box. Michael felt the of past and present colliding in a way he couldn't explain. 30 years had passed, but in that moment, with that dog there, waiting to be recognized, waiting to come home, time didn't seem to matter anymore. Some answers come too late, when no one expected, when life has already taken its course, and the truth once so longed for seems to have missed the right moment to be revealed. Does the truth have a right time to appear, or does it always find a way to emerge, even if it takes decades? Michael watched David pick up one of the inside the box with trembling hands, his face tense, his breathing ragged, as if he felt that piece of paper a much greater weight than it seemed. The dog was still there, lying next to them, his eyes to every movement without looking away, without showing anxiety. He waited. He knew. David ran his fingers over the yellowed paper, feeling aged texture, immediately recognizing his mother's delicate handwriting. It was strange to see something written by her so long later, as if voice could travel through the years and reach that exact moment. He hesitated for a moment, as if preparing his own heart for what he was about read. He took a deep breath, swallowed hard, and then began reading, his voice wavering slightly by an emotion that he tried to contain. "My children, if you ever find this letter, I want you to know the truth." The silence in the basement, the air around them, seemed to become thicker, each word echoing as if it were spoken by someone who was no longer there. Michael felt a shiver run up his spine, as if a part of him already knew he about to hear something that would change everything. "I never had the courage to tell you." But Shadow didn't run. The first break in David's voice happened there. He stopped for a second, pressed his lips together, and took a deep breath, but couldn't stop his hand from shaking a little as he held the sheet. Michael felt his chest tighten, as if his entire body already knew what was, even if his mind was still trying to protect itself. He looked at the dog, who remained still, attentive, calmly, his eyes shining in the dim light of the basement. "It was stolen. I tried to find it, but I never could." The lump in Michael's throat almost unbearable. Throughout their childhood, he and David carried the guilt of not having been careful, of not having been more attentive, of not having realized that something could happen to. They spent years wondering if they could have done something different, if somehow the dog would found its way back if they had looked harder, if they hadn't given up. Now, after 3 decades, the answer they never had there, written in faded ink, stored in a forgotten box in the basement. Shadow never ran away. He never abandoned them. He got lost. He was taken from them, ripped away without them being able to do anything, without them being able to stop it. David lowered the letter a moment, resting his forearm on his knee, running his other hand over his face as if trying to contain the emotions that to overflow. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that feeling, the truth sink into places he didn't even know were still empty inside him. He didn't know what hurt more, that Shadow spent all these years away from them, or realizing that his mother carried this truth alone until the end of her life, without ever sharing with her children what really happened. The paper shook slightly as David lifted the letter again, blinking a few times, continuing. "If he ever comes back to you, know that he has always been part of our family." The last sentence hung in the air, a whisper, a farewell that crossed time to finally be heard. That followed was absolute, filled only by the two brothers' heavy breathing, the low hum of the old cellar lamp, and the faint rustle of the tail against the floor. Michael looked at him, and in that instant everything seemed to stop. The dog observed them, his head slightly tilted, his expression serene as if he knew exactly what those words meant. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed confused. You knew. David exhaled slowly as if he was trying to take it all in, but when he finally looked up at his brother, that escaped his lips was almost a whisper. What does that mean? Michael didn't respond. He had no answer. His mind was spinning, trying to find a logical explanation, trying to fit the impossible into reality. But everything inside him said there was no coincidence there. There was chance. There was no other explanation. His gaze returned to the dog, and the moment their eyes met, he felt something inside him snap. It wagged its tail slowly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if it only confirmed what they already knew. Even if they didn't want to admit, was it possible? 30 years had passed. A dog can only live that long. It cannot disappear and return decades in the same way, with the same look, as if not a single day had passed. But if he wasn't Shadow, then why did seem that way? Why did he take them to that box? Why did he seem to know exactly where he was, exactly who they were? David rubbed over his face, laughing humorlessly, as if it was all a big delusion. This is crazy, man. Michael wanted to agree. He wanted to say that it was impossible, that a dog couldn't just come back after 3 decades. But he looked at that animal and felt the same in his chest as when he was a child, the same connection, the same feeling that he was always there. Dog moved forward a little, stopped in front of the two, and as if he had nothing left to prove, lay down next to the box and closed his eyes. Calm, completely at peace, as if he knew that after so long he was finally where he always should have been. Michael could no longer hold back he didn't know what was happening, he didn't know how, but he knew that the dog in front of them was not he was always part of the family. It was always Shadow. He was just waiting for the right moment return. Some decisions are not made based on logic, but rather on what we feel deep in our soul, in that where words cannot reach, where explanations are not necessary. Michael looked at the dog lying in front of him and felt the weight of he couldn't name. 30 years passed, time followed its course, and yet there was a black Labrador with eyes that carried a story that no one knew how to tell, a look that seemed to cross the years and find the two directly, as if he had never left. There was something about the way he breathed, the calmness which he lay on the basement floor, as if he was waiting for Michael and David to understand something he already knew. Michael's heart pounding, not from fear, but from the strange feeling that he was about to make a decision that would change everything. David was at side, his expression still confused, trying to rationalize what they were experiencing. He passed his hands over his face, took a deep look at the box, at the old photo, at the letter from their mother, and most importantly, at the dog. He wanted to find an answer, something to make sense, but there was nothing there that could be explained. The dog didn't look out of place, didn't look like a stranger. He looked someone who had always been part of that house. He knew every corner as if he had been there before. He knew exactly where to find the box, recognized the two brothers as if they had never been apart. And what made it all even more disturbing was the fact that he didn't act like a lost dog for a home. There was no fear in his eyes, no uncertainty, that hesitation common in street dogs. He wasn't asking to stay. He already knew that the house was his. He was just hoping they would accept it too. Felt his mind spinning, his thoughts confused, unable to define whether they were dealing with a miracle, an unbelievable coincidence, or something would never be able to understand. He wanted to ask David if he felt the same way, but as he looked at he saw in his eyes the same uncertainty, the same emotion, the same doubt that consumed him. They didn't need to say anything. Both knew that any answer they sought would never come. They would never know how that dog found them. They would never understand how he knew so much that place. They would never be able to prove if it was an inexplicable connection, or if, in some way, defied everything they knew about the world. Shadow had really come back to them. The dog raised his head, looking directly at Michael, eyes calm but filled with something that made his chest tighten. He remembered the first time he held Shadow on his lap as a child, the warmth of that body, the way he snuggled into his chest without fear, without resistance, as if he had been born to be there. The dog in front of was now no longer a puppy. Its appearance carried the marks of time, of the years spent on the street, of the difficulties but there was still the same essence in it, the same silent loyalty, the same trust that is only built when two souls are in a way that goes beyond understanding. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the heavy basement fill his lungs as if he was about to take a leap into the dark. He looked at David and saw that he had also made his, even if he hadn't said anything yet. He lowered his head and let out a low, nervous laugh, as if was giving up trying to understand and just accepting what he felt. Without looking at his brother, he spoke almost casually, but the emotion in voice was undeniable. "We can't let him go." Michael knew that phrase meant much more than it seemed. It wasn't just about adopting dog. It wasn't just about bringing home an animal that needed a home. It was about accepting the impossible. It was recognizing that some things just they are, regardless of how or why. Time seemed to slow down as Michael bent down, feeling the weight of far greater than he could comprehend. The cold wood of the floor creaked slightly beneath his knees, and the smell of dust and paper seemed to dissipate around him, as if the environment itself understood that this moment was unlike any other. His hovered in the air for a second, his fingers slightly trembling, as if the simple act of extending them could change everything. And maybe it was. Dog watched every movement with an almost solemn calm, his eyes shining in the dim light of the basement, his breathing steady, as if he already knew would happen. Then, without hesitation, he stood up, his lean but firm muscles moving with a calm ease. Their steps were slow, sure, each of them bringing a silent wave of emotion that seemed to fill the space between them. When he stood before Michael, was no fear, no doubt, just a mutual acceptance, a recognition that needed no words. Then the dog placed its head against Michael's leg, its hot passing through the fabric of his pants, and for a moment that seemed to last in time, it simply stayed there. He closed his eyes slowly, as in that gesture, he was confirming something he already knew from the moment he followed Michael home. As if to say he was always waiting to come, Michael felt a wave of warmth rise through his chest, a relief so deep it was almost like breathing after underwater. There was something inside him that had been out of place for so long that he noticed its absence. But now, at that very moment, everything fell into place. Beside him, David let out a long sigh, the kind of sigh that carries with it a weight that words cannot describe. He shook head slightly, as if he was still fighting the emotion that threatened to overflow, and quickly passed his hand over his eyes, a discreet but full of meaning. His gaze returned to the dog, and for a moment he just watched it as if wanting to make sure it was real. Then his was low, almost hesitant, carrying a mixture of disbelief and hope. Shadow. The dog opened its eyes at the same moment, its body reacting a subtle but unmistakable way. The ears rose slightly, the tail moved just once over the ground, and that look, so deep and met David's as if that name had never been forgotten. Michael closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the last resistance within him, as if all this time he had been fighting something he already knew to be true. He took a deep breath, and, when opened his eyes again, a small smile formed on his lips, filled with an emotion that didn't need to be explained. "Welcome back." Shadow wagged tail, a calm movement but full of meaning. At that moment, the past and the present ceased to be separate things. They had found each stitching together a story that should never have been interrupted. Shadow was home, and in some inexplicable way, it always has. Some connections are inexplicable. They cross time, resist oblivion, defy any logical explanation, and somehow remain alive, silently for the right moment to remake themselves. Michael didn't know how, he didn't know why, but he felt inside that Shadow never really left that dog that was now breathing calmly beside you, its eyes half closed, its body relaxed as if it finally home. Wasn't just any animal that showed up at your door. He was part of something bigger, something that Michael David spent their lives without realizing still existed within them. The room was immersed in a cozy gloom, the only light from the lamp next to the sofa, casting soft shadows on the walls. The air carried the light smell of wood and coffee, mixed with the presence of Shadow, who had settled in exactly the same place as years ago, as if he knew that this was always his space. Michael ran his hand through the soft fur, and as he felt the dog's rhythmic breathing against his leg, it was impossible not to be transported back childhood. He remembered the nights when Shadow would lie down exactly like this, pressing his body his, seeking warmth and security, falling asleep in a matter of minutes, peaceful in the knowledge that he was where he was supposed to be. At that time, he never thought about what it meant. He never imagined that one day he missed this little ritual of silent complicity. He never knew how much he would miss this presence by his side. Now, later, this scene repeated itself as if time had folded in on itself, as if everything had returned to the point it never should have left. Shadow was the way he always was, as if the years of absence had never existed. Michael felt his chest tighten with a mixture of emotion and relief, if something that had been misaligned inside him for so long had finally found its place. David observed the scene from the other side of the room, arms crossed, a discreet smile on his lips, a look that carried as much understanding as words could never express. He also remembered. He felt it, even if he still couldn't explain it, even if there were still doubts about how it was all possible. He knew that somehow destiny had a way to bring Shadow back to them. Michael looked at his brother, catching that subtle smile that said more than any long conversation. There was no longer any need to try to understand. Some things were not meant to be explained, just to be felt. He looked away at Shadow, who was now breathing deeply, falling into a peaceful, safe sleep. If he was finally where he always should have been. He ran his fingers through the dog's soft fur, feeling the warm texture against his skin, and let thought take over his mind without any resistance. Some connections are never lost, no matter how much time passes, no matter what happens, to how much life tries to move on without them. Some connections always find a way back. Michael sighed, feeling the last resistance within him completely. He didn't need anything else. Shadow was there, and that was all that mattered. Some stories have power to awaken something within us, to make us feel that deep connection that only those who love animals can understand. If you've this far, it's because you felt this connection, because you know that some presences never completely disappear, because you've already or dream of living something as special as this story, and just as this story touched you, it can touch even more people. A like makes more people find this video and feel the same way you felt. In the comments, write "Shadow is back," because anyone who has come this far, the true meaning of these words. And if this story moved you, wait until you see what comes next. Some stories us believe that animals are capable of incredible feats. Others make us question everything we think we know about them. And the next one will give you goosebumps. What are you waiting for? The next video is already on the screen.